Our next book of the Bible in 5 minutes is the book of 2 Samuel, and we left off with 1 Samuel. It was the death of Saul, and then so 2 Samuel is going to be centered around David. And David, in the critical part, he plays in the history of salvation, and God is building this eternal dynasty through David's house. And so this is looking ahead to Jesus Christ. And we see in the Bible, it's always looking ahead. And so the end of 2 Samuel is going to be looking ahead to the temple, which is, again, looking ahead to Christ as the temple. And we're always looking ahead. You know, even now that Christ has come and been raised from the dead, we're looking ahead to when God's kingdom will come. And so we have our hope rooted in God. And so the beginning of 2 Samuel, David hears about the death of Saul. And he leads this public lament, right? David has been wronged by Saul, but he still honors Saul. And so we see how complex people are. I was talking with Caleb last night about how complicated people are, and they're rarely all good or all bad. And David, who's called a man after God's own heart, and who does all sorts of things wrong in this book, and yet all sorts of things right. And so we see good and bad, and yet God is working to redeem. So David is anointed king of Judah, and then there's this struggle for 7 years with Saul's surviving son. And then eventually the ark is brought to Jerusalem, and we see, Tim Keller preaches a great sermon, how in the bringing of the ark, we see both the incredible holiness of God and the graciousness of God. There's the scene where a man reaches out to touch the ark, which is forbidden just due to the pure holiness of God. You know, it says this man is trying to help God. And so he is struck dead, and so we see just the pure holiness of God. And then so they leave the ark. They have fear of it, and so they just leave it with somebody. And the ark brings this incredible blessing to them. And then David realizes how holy and how gracious God is. And so this is what leads to David dancing before the ark as it's brought into Jerusalem. And then next we have in chapter 7 this pivotal moment in the Old Testament in human history where David wants to build a house for the ark. And God says, I'm going to build a house from your lineage. So your David's son Solomon will build the temple, but God is going to establish the throne of King David forever. And God's steadfast love will not depart from David's line. And so we have this eternal promise that God makes looking forward. And David's response is, who am I? God has done this for me. This is about what God has graciously done. And so we have this incredible scene, and then good things happen, right? David only does good things, right? We wish, if only. Instead, there's this in chapter 11, David and Bathsheba. It's called a time when kings go out to war, and yet David is at home. So something's wrong here. And then David goes up on the roof in the afternoon, at a time when he knew he would have seen people bathing because they would put the water on the roof in the morning to heat up during the day and then take a bath in the afternoon. And so David goes up and sees Bathsheba bathing. David knows she's married but sends for her anyway. She gets pregnant. And so David then tries to cover it up. It's only when she gets pregnant when he really has guilt. He tries to cover it up. He brings her husband home from war. But her husband is focused on honoring the people who are at war, showing more honor than David has. And, it's a contrast. And so David then has him killed in battle. This is all about trying to hide his sin. And then Nathan, the prophet, rebukes him and shows him his wrong and talks about how God has given David everything, and yet David still wanted more. And this is a warning about the destructive power of appetites. So David laments. He ends up having another child who would be Solomon, who would go on to be the next king. And so what we see is God bringing good out of tragedy, God's ability to do this. But the evil, the sin that David did, the evil stays with his house. Absalom, David's son, ends up killing his half-brother to avenge his sister's rape, which is all sorts of messed up. Absalom is pardoned, but then leads this rebellion. David flees Jerusalem. Eventually, Absalom is killed. David mourns for his son, and we just see the brokenness here. There's another rebellion. In chapter 22, we get this David's song of deliverance, which matches up with Psalm 22. And it's this cry to God. It's this lament in times of distress and has this image of God's love and devotion to the people. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge. And it goes on and says, God sent from on high. God took me. God drew me out of many waters and rescued me from my strong enemy. And so we have, again, this cry of distress and God's rescue. Despite sin, despite brokenness, God rescues us. And then finally in chapter 24, David sins by taking the census. But then there's money that comes in that's used to buy a threshing floor, which is where the temple would be built, where Solomon would build the temple on this threshing floor that's built out of sin. And so again, God is bringing good things out of bad, and then God is looking forward to what comes next.